Well, here we are back at Galilee again, picking up where Ryan left off last week. We see the disciples post-resurrection, post 2 appearances from Jesus. The disciples had been unsure of what to do next. Did they go back to fishing because they were confused about what to do next? What did all this mean for them? Were they fearful without Jesus, fearful about their future without Jesus? So they tried fishing, because after all, that's what they knew best. But in that act of going fishing, they actually went backwards. And it turned out a disaster from dusk to dawn. It often does when we rely on our own strength, doesn't it? And at dawn, here is Jesus calling out to them from the shore. Now, I don't know about you, but I can often recognise people just by their body shape. Without my glasses, and even sometimes with them, I don't often recognise people's face from a distance. Maybe the sun was behind Jesus and reflecting in their faces, and so they couldn't quite see Jesus' face, but not to recognise his shape. This was a man that they had spent every day of 3 years with. What was going on in their minds? Was there such a sense of disappointment, rejection, lostness that they were unable to see properly? Whatever the reasons, they didn't at first realise it was Jesus. But Jesus offers them breakfast, fish and bread. Do you hear the echoes of another story of loaves and fish? Maybe Jesus was trying to remind them of many things in the offering of that fish and that bread. But in the midst of this miracle of a vast catch of fish, an unexpected and unprecedented abundance of fish, we can see the faithfulness of the fullness of God. Here is Jesus calling them back again to him, transformed again to the disciples he had been nurturing for the last 3 years. And then Jesus singles out Peter, Simon Peter, on whom Jesus would build his church on earth. This is such a well-known story to us, and we've heard it often. But this week's theme is about serving, and here we have a conversation about love. So let's go back and remember what we've come through the last 5 weeks. If we're talking about a life of discipleship, and what that means and looks like for us in 2020 and beyond, let's look back at for a moment about what we've discovered so far. Jesus calls us to follow him and surrender, to become a disciple. And we were reminded that Jesus often calls us to follow him. It's not a once in a lifetime, but many calls over a lifetime. And once we accept that invitation, Jesus wants us to confess who he is. Who do you say I am? To be called is one thing. To confess and name who we are following is quite another. And this has to be a personal answer. Thirdly, we confront our own failures and denials of the Christ. And as we reflect on Peter's behaviour and words in front of the fire in the home of the high priest, we are confronted with our own attitudes, our own behaviours, our own words of denial and failures. We may feel we have never verbally denied Christ, but often our behaviours deny him more than we realise. And Jesus looked at Peter. And in that look, Peter wept. Not because of any judgment on the face of Jesus, but because of a look that contained unconditional love. Back at the lake, they go fishing. What else were they to do? In light of denials and running away and desertion and guilt and fear, what else were they to do? But after a night of dismal failure, Jesus calls them to eat with him. So now we can turn to this conversation between Jesus and Simon Peter and those 3 questions. 1, Jesus, do you love me more than these? This may be referring to the disciples around the fire eating breakfast, but there are other interpretations. Peter, you know I love you. Jesus, feed my lambs. Question 2, Jesus, do you truly love me? Peter, you know I love you. Jesus, take care of my sheep. Question number 3. Jesus says, do you love me? This time there was no truly, just do you love me? Peter heard after being asked a 3rd time, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. Jesus, feed my sheep. Many of us have heard sermons on this text, multiple sermons on this text, about Jesus reinstating Peter after his denial, hence the 3 questions. Messages about the difference in the Greek terminology of the word love, completely lost basically in the English language. But what can these words say to us this morning? If we're thinking about serving, what do these words and this story say to us? In the asking of these questions and in his replies to Simon Peter, Jesus places Peter as a model of what it means for all disciples to live out one's love for Jesus. I can hear echoes of John 13:34. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. Love is not a feeling. It is not just an emotion. Love is an action word. You have to do something with love. You can't just say you feel love. Love is an action word. You have to put it into action. Jesus asks Peter to feed and take care of his sheep and lambs. This was Jesus reminding Peter and the disciples, who I'm sure were probably listening in, to put love into practice, into action. As Peter was answering Jesus' questions, each time Peter said, you know that I love you, Peter was pledging his life in service to Jesus. This was not lip service, but a distinct pledge. We see that in the way Peter conducted the rest of his life for the glory of Jesus. It is Jesus who calls his followers to be a disciple who put no limits on their love, but will love and therefore serve to the end. When Jesus says, feed, lead my sheep, my lambs, there were things Peter and all the disciples were and are called to do. Jesus said, if you love me, do these things out of and from the love you have for me. In other words, act. Mother Teresa once said, not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. She also said, if you judge other people, you have no time to love them. Whether we're called to great things as Mother Teresa or small things in the context of our local community or our neighbours, we all receive Jesus' gifts to serve. It is he who enables us to serve, and no one misses out on the gifts that he gives. They may be different for each one of us, but no one misses out. And in our love, we are called to act. And again, I say love is an action word. And if we say we love Jesus, we are called to do something about it, not lip service, because that's just not enough. What we do physically expresses that love. It's about serving others in the love that we have for Jesus. And then right at the end of this conversation that we've been privy to, Jesus says to Peter once again, follow me. Another call to discipleship. We will probably have experienced this ourselves after or following failure. In our uncertainty of what comes next, there is once again Jesus' distinct call to follow him, love him, serve him. We're invited in John 20:21 to see how we will experience Jesus' presence and then carry his work forward, i.e. how we will serve him. And we serve him best when we love others, because Jesus said, by this will all men know that you are my disciples. In this conversation with Jesus, Peter is enabled to move beyond his denial, beyond any doubt he may have had, into a relationship of unity, intimacy and maturity with God. And in these things, it was those things that enabled him to serve with the love that he does from here on in. Peter's love and as for Jesus will only be evidenced when we care for and feed the sheep and the lambs in the love we have for Jesus. And lastly, as Peter shared that breakfast and conversation with Jesus, as Jesus asks those questions and Peter replies, don't you think Peter saw Jesus' hands? Don't you think he saw the scars? Don't you think he relived the pain and the experience of seeing Jesus crucified? I don't doubt for one moment that Peter failed to see the scarred hands. He would have noticed. And I wonder if Peter thought as he answered Jesus' questions, as he saw the scars, that he said to himself, nothing I could ever do can repay all that he has done for me. I ought to love. I will love. I do love. And out of that love came a life of loving action.